Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the recent inflation report and get an idea of where inflation could be headed in the remainder of the year, as well as dive into the odds of rate cuts happening before 2026, as this recent inflation report potentially could have changed some things around. If you're new to the channel, my name is Ian Phillips. I'm a real estate agent in Southern California. I love diving into some housing data, talking about the economy, and how everything relates to housing. And in this video, I want to dive into inflation, talk about the odds of interest rate cuts, and potentially how that could impact mortgage rates. And if you're not aware, the Fed cutting interest rates doesn't necessarily always lead to mortgage rates going down. And I'll give you some historic examples later in the video, as recent as 2024. If you like this video, subscribe for more and let's get straight into it. All right, so the recent inflation report was actually the Wholesale Producer Price Index, which measures essentially what companies are paying for products and whether or not their costs have increased. We'll also take a look at the Consumer Price Index, which is what consumers pay. And for a easy comparison, you can kind of think of it like a river. So PPI, or Producer Price Index, is essentially everything upstream. CPI, Consumer Price Index, is essentially everything downstream, perhaps people like you and I. Me as a consumer, I mostly care about CPI, what I'm paying for goods and services, and whether or not that is getting more expensive on a monthly and yearly basis. Producer Price Index, being upstream in a river, can often lead to prices increasing downstream for us as consumers. So we're going to see whether or not that could potentially indicate, at least this recent report could indicate, if consumer prices are about to increase. So if you're unaware, PPI, Producer Price Index, came in significantly higher than expected in the recent report, increasing 0.9% month over month, and consensus was increasing 0.2%, so way higher than every analyst, every economist expected for this month. Obviously, the main concern is whether or not tariffs are causing wholesale companies to pay significantly more than everyone anticipated. And it potentially is lining up to that being the outcome of tariffs being implemented. Now, if we look at this chart, which is the history of monthly PPI numbers, we can see that the last time PPI increased this much was in May and June of 2022. Now we'll take a look at exactly what CPI was doing around the same time to give us an idea of where CPI could be headed into the remainder of the year. Because the big topic right now in the economy is, one, inflation, and two, unemployment. And the Fed is likely not going to cut rates multiple times this year if inflation is showing signs of ramping back up. Now, fortunately, at the time I'm making this video, we will have another set of inflationary and unemployment data before the next Fed meeting in the month of September. So that will give the Fed a more accurate measurement of whether or not inflation is actually coming back for another round, or if this is just a one-off data set. Because we did see in June of 2022, Producer Price Index came in at 0.9% month over month, and then literally the next month it went negative. So in July of 2022, it went to negative 0.3%. So producers were paying less in the span of 30 days. So that is interesting to note. And I do want to see sort of what CPI was doing around that same time. But this is a pretty important data metric to somewhat pay attention to, because just in March and April of this year, it was also negative month over month, and now positive 0.9 is a pretty big difference. So if we take a look at CPI, it was a 2.7% increase year over year, and a very negligible change from last month, which was also 2.7%, and in May, a minor change from 2.4%. So month over month, CPI hasn't really changed. But since May, it's only up a modest 0.3%. So consumers, as of right now, aren't really paying significantly more for the average good and service. But as it stands, companies, wholesalers, they are paying more for that initial product. Now, the argument is going to be whether or not they just take it in the shorts and reduce their profit margin, or if they're going to pass along those extra costs to us as consumers. And then we potentially see consumer inflation increasing as a result of wholesalers and companies paying more for products. But if we take a look at what was happening in 2022, so as I mentioned, June, that was when producer prices were 0.9%. And in June 2020, oh, this is 2023, here we go, in June of 2022, CPI, which is consumer inflation, was at 9.1%. And we saw that in PPI have the largest increase month over month of 0.9%. So this is when inflation actually peaked for consumers. And in July of 2022, inflation went from 9.1 to 8.5, and then 8.3, 8.2, and carried on going down. So this period of time in June of 2022, that is when consumer inflation actually hit its highest point of 9.1%. And if we take a look at this month over month change here of producer prices, June is when it had the highest month over month increase, and then the following month dropped drastically to negative 0.3%. So if we got the recent July producer price index of 0.9%, and then CPI only came in at a modest 2.7% year over year, potentially this could be an indication that consumers might not be having to take the inflationary pressures that a lot of people have been talking about. Obviously, we're going to see what happens in the September inflation report, which will measure this month in August how much prices have changed. Now, my optimistic belief is that consumer inflation is not going to have another surge like we saw in 2021 and 2022. I do believe unemployment increasing slightly is going to have an impact on how much the average consumer is willing to pay for a product. So we might just see companies taking it in the shorts due to these tariffs and not being able to offset some of those additional costs onto us as consumers. Because if you think about it, consumer demand is really what makes up consumer inflation. Yeah, sure, companies could be paying a little more to bring in goods and products. If they increase those prices and pass it on to us as consumers, we might just stop buying that product. We've already seen this a lot with restaurant chains, places like Cava, places like Sweet Greens, places like Chipotle. They have noticed a demand destruction sort of happening in their product as they have been increasing their prices year over year for quite some time. Me personally, I don't really want to pay $15, $20 for a very average lunch when I could just make something similar at home for less than $5. But perhaps that's just me. So that is sort of my optimistic viewpoint. Now, I do want to get into the actual odds of rate cuts later this year and also talk briefly about whether or not interest rate cuts are actually going to impact mortgage rates. So if we look at the Fed rate monitoring tool, which basically are investors, sort of betting whether or not the Fed is going to cut interest rates and what the likelihood of that cut is going to be. So as it stands in the month of September, there's a 92% chance that the Fed is going to cut rates by 25 basis points. And this recent wholesale price index inflation number didn't actually change this. Just yesterday, before this report came out, it was still roughly a 90% chance that the Fed was going to cut. If we go to the month of October, which is the meeting after September, there is currently a 55% chance that the Fed is going to cut yet again. But where this report did change things was in the December report. So previously, there was a higher likelihood that the Fed was going to cut for a third time in the month of December, but now it has shifted more toward the Fed not cutting rates for the third time and just leaving rates where they are after that second cut. Now, I do want to talk briefly about how interest rate cuts actually impact mortgage rates, because a lot of people seem to be under this belief that if the Fed cuts by 0.25%, then obviously mortgage rates are going to drop by 0.25%, and that is not the case. We saw this in 2024 when the Fed cut rates a full percentage point and mortgage rates actually went up But what was interesting, leading up to that September rate cut of 2024, mortgage rates were their lowest they were all year. And as the Fed started cutting rates, mortgage rates increased. And the reason this happened is because mortgage rates are forward-looking. It essentially follows the 10-year Treasury yield, which is not paying attention to the current data, but future data. And the reason mortgage rates increased after the Fed cut in 2024 is because inflation started going back up, unemployment also started going back up, and all of a sudden investors were like, oh, the Fed is not going to carry on cutting rates. They were too soon, and they should have just held rates steady and not started cutting them a full percent. So that's why mortgage rates went back over 7% after the Fed cut in 2024, and they were higher than where they were prior to the Fed actually cutting rates in the month of September. So my fear is that if we do in fact have another round of inflation coming back to consumers, and the Fed does go ahead with their rate cut in September and potentially October, is that it might not actually change mortgage rates. At the time of making this video, mortgage rates are a little around 6.6%. And if we see mortgage rates continuing to stay where they are, with no increased expectation of rate cuts happening in the end of this year and into 2026, then interest rate cuts in September and October probably won't have a large impact on mortgage rates. If you want mortgage rates to go down, you essentially need to see unemployment increasing slightly, getting closer to 4.5%, and consumer inflation not going up, which is a little worrying considering producer prices went up quite a lot in this recent report. So that is what a lot of investors are going to be looking at. Fortunately, we have another set of data coming out before the next Fed meeting in September, and that will give us an accurate idea of whether or not this recent producer price index increasing is going to directly impact consumer prices. If we look back historically, they are not always correlated, but it would make sense if producers are taking it in the shorts due to tariffs. They are going to try offset some of that cost to consumers. But there's really the conversation of consumer demand. Are consumers willing to pay more money for the same good and service, or are they just going to opt for not paying for that? Obviously, the bare minimum, food, shelter, if that increases, consumers aren't really going to have a choice. But places like restaurants, apparel, your leisurely activities, consumers probably aren't willing to pay even more for that moving forward because prices have already increased drastically over the last 5 years, essentially. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. If you like this video, subscribe for more. My name's Ian Phillips. I'm a realtor in Southern California. And like I mentioned, I love talking about data, the economy, mortgage rates, the housing market, and how it all ties in together. I'll see you next time.